Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's talk. The Political Economy Seminar Series is a monthly event organized by the Research Department at the Inter-American Development Bank. My name is Razvan Vlaicu, and I am a senior economist at the Research Department. Today's speaker is Leopoldo Ferguson. Leopoldo is an associate professor at the University of Los Andes in Colombia, and he also serves as director of the Center for Development Economics Research at Los Andes. His research interests are political economy, economic history, and development economics. Today, he will be speaking about the relationship between state capacity and political clientelism. Some housekeeping items, particularly for the audience. The seminar will go on for an hour, and the speaker will have 45 minutes to make the presentation, and the last 15 minutes are going to be for Q&A. The speaker will also pause every 15 minutes during the presentation to check whether there are any audience questions. To the audience, if you would like to ask a question, which I strongly encourage, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. And when you get the permission to speak, please go ahead and unmute your microphone. If you prefer, you can also type your answer in the chat window in Zoom. Okay, with that, I believe we are ready to start. So Leopoldo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Raz, for the introduction and for this invitation. I'm really happy to be sharing with you this work today. So let me, as I share my screen and put the slides on, just say that, you know, this is a piece of research that is probably not the usual kind of thing that economists are, at least recently, used to producing, in the sense that this is not really looking at a narrowly defined question that we try to kind of disentangle with as much care to have a, you know, well-identified empirical design that allows us to examine the effect of a given variable on another. This is more of a thought piece that looks at broad issues and then looks at a number of empirical pieces that fit together into this broad conceptual framework. And so in that sense, you know, be prepared for a kind of a broader discussion. I do encourage in the Q&A for any of your reactions, taking that into account. This is joint work with Carlos Molina and Jim Robinson. And since, you know, as I said, this is kind of a different paper than the one that probably you are most used to seeing, let me start with a story. So this is the story of clientelism as told by one of the longest serving Colombian senators in an interview that he gave to the news outlet La Silla Vacía upon retiring. And he was basically describing clientelism in Colombia in the following terms. He says, you know, if you just look at the title, he's saying, you know, in Colombia, everyone is clientelistic, rich and poor. But then let me just share with you a couple of other quotes from the interview. He's saying there is clientelism at all levels of Colombian society. The country is clientelistic. Everyone needs things and they request them from those who can get them. A state absence produces clientelism. I will not say I didn't do clientelism. Of course I did clientelism. And finally, even in Sweden, in Nordic countries with such high standards of living, there are needs and things to solve and powerful people who help solve them. It is a less personalistic clientelism, but it still exists. So I just want you to hold to this description on your mind, because I'm going to be talking largely about this phenomena, less from this anecdotal kind of description, but more from a systematic collection of data and trying to fit some pieces together over the story that Roberto Gerlain is telling us here. The second story that I want to tell you is one that, you know, Colombians will be familiar with. We find very often stories such as one that occurred actually this very week to a close acquaintance of mine. Uh, she was trying to help a relative in selling a property. And here was just a short clip that I want to share with you of what she was told by the real estate
Con
kind of broker.
referente al cambio que hubo,
So
que
before I let
ahora
this
se le
play,
tiene.
I should say perhaps you should ramp up the volume of your computer, because this is, you know, a voice note that was transferred, so it's not the best volume. And let's see what she says.
Con referente al cambio que hubo, que ahora se le tiene que pagar por medio de un tercero, le comento. Lo que pasa es que por eso, usted sabe que nosotros somos empresa, la empresa que compra es empresa. El tema del IVA. eh, Nosotros declaramos renta, por eso es que le cobran el IVA. Al evadir ese impuesto, nosotros pues tenemos que hacerlo a través de un tercero. La señora es la esposa del gerente de la inmobiliaria. Ahora, si usted está dispuesta a pagar el IVA, pues igualmente quedaría la inmobiliaria. Pero igualmente, señora, eso a usted no le implica en nada. Pues el comprador no tiene inconveniente. Él me dijo que le explicara el motivo por el cual, y yo le comenté la situación, que era por el tema del IVA y eso. Entonces, pues me dijo, bueno, yo de mi parte no tengo objeción sobre eso.
So the clip that I just shared is probably something that will look familiar to many people in places like Colombia and other countries in which, you know, tax morale is not as well established. And it is very common, so much so that I was just preparing these slides this week, and this thing happened. And it happens very often. Perhaps the new thing is that now when it happens, it gets recorded on a voice note on WhatsApp, so you can share it in presentations. But it's something that is very common to find. People assuming as something very normal not to pay some tax. And like this lady said in this voice note, you know, well, in order to evade this tax, just saying that without any guilt or shame, and just talking about the VAT as if it was something that you could choose whether to pay or not. No, at some point she says, well, but if you want to pay it, then we would do it this other way. It's up to you. Something that it's not really like mandatory, but sort of optional. Now let's move from those two anecdotes to something more academic. So we can think, following Weber, on two types of estates. One, the patrimonial kind of estates, and the rational legal bureaucracies. And if we make this comparison between these two string types, in the patrimonial estates, the estates are organized on a strictly personal loyalty. And the rational legal, the ones that are, you know, the guiding principle is rational legal bureaucracies, it's actually organized on the official's commitment to an impersonal purpose and to an obedience to some abstract norms. A second difference is that, you know, power in a patrimonial estate is discretionary. It's not controlled by rules. It has rents that are given in exchange for the rendering of certain services. Whereas in the other type of estate, you are limited by rules. There are checks so that public resources are not used for own interests. Weber makes this comparison and he concludes, the decisive reason for the advance of the bureaucratic organization has always been its purely technical superiority. So I want to argue that, you know, no to the first part, although yes to the second. What do I mean by that? I mean that, you know, by now there's a bunch of research from economics saying, you know, Weber is right. There's one organization that is superior to the other. State capacity actually is related, and so people claim causally related to development outcomes. So if you can move to the second type of a state, you are going to probably have a more efficient state apparatus and a more efficient economy. Now, what I want to say no is that it's not true that you are always going to move to that more efficient form of organization. Actually, state weakness persists. And one of the reasons why it does is that political incentives are key in explaining why some people oppose building state capacities. So this paper is going to look precisely at that, and it's going to focus on clientelism. One of the key features of that of that state described as patrimonial by Weber, but basically, you know, the exchange of political support for particularistic benefits as a prevailing aspect of exchanges in politics. I'm going to show you microcorrelation, that is at the level of the individual. I'm going to show you how clientelism, measured as vote buying, is closely correlated with the state weakness, measured as tax evasion, and I'm going to justify both ways of measuring these key concepts. And I'm going to show you that they are intimately connected in the data. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to share some theoretical mechanisms and some evidence on why this correlation exists and why it may be a trap, in the sense that clientelism creates a state weakness, but a state weakness is also kind of the right environment for clientelism to flourish. So once you are in this kind of situation, it's really hard to get off of that equilibrium. Okay, so that's sort of my introduction. Now I'm going to share basically three messages. I'm going to tell you a bit about the data, the concepts that we're using and how we measure them. I'm going to then show you the very strong link between these two phenomena. And then I'm going to describe the weak state trap, this sort of trap between these two phenomena, the theoretical mechanisms that link them together, and some evidence that is consistent with those mechanisms. Okay, so first, how should we measure state capacity? So here I want to focus not only on a capable state, but on a consensually capable state. And what I mean by that, you know, following Acemoglu and others, is that the state has capacity because citizens know they can control it. So they have decided to endow the state with capacity. And in this context, we're thinking of control and power as complements. Because I know that I can hold the state accountable, I'm willing to give it a certain amount of faculties and power. This is a way to solve what people like Levinson call the fundamental dilemma of state power, which is that a state that is powerful enough to deliver goods is also powerful enough to do harm. So you might want to kind of control its powers. How can you solve this dilemma? Well, by making sure that you have some control on that power. If you have this concept in mind, we like, as a measure of consensual state capacity, tax evasion. And why? Basically because it captures both sides of the coin. It captures both the state's capacity to mobilize resources and to enforce the law, but it also captures the citizens' acceptance of, you know, the social contract in which citizens pay taxes and then expect things back from the government in exchange for those taxes as an institutional kind of exchange. Now, in our empirical application, we're going to focus on the VAT, you know, the value-added tax, because it is a tax that everyone is familiar with. Other taxes, such as, for example, the income tax, are not commonly paid by large parts of the population in developing countries, and certainly that is the case in Colombia. Now, to measure clientelism, I just want to point out that clientelism is an entire network of exchanges where this giving rents in exchange from some political support is what marks kind of political interactions. It can happen at the level of the president trying to pass a law, and then it has to give some benefits to particular congressmen, some private benefits, so that the congressmen give him support for the law. It can happen at the level of different politicians who are sharing benefits with each other so that they give each other also political support to advance in their careers. Now, oftentimes what we focus on is at the very low level of clientelistic exchange, here at the level of the voter, in which a voter probably gives a vote to the political leader or broker, who then gives some money or other personal benefits to this voter. But I want to point out that although that's the common measure of clientelism, it's not there in isolation. We usually use this measure just because it is easy to capture that measure. It's easy to go out and ask people, have you sold your vote? But this is really kind of integrated into a network of exchanges in which this leader probably gives votes to a politician who is giving benefits to the leader, and this politician is embedded in these kind of exchanges. Otherwise, he wouldn't be interested in giving money to get the votes, right? So we will measure clientelism in the usual way by vote buying, but not because it is kind of the best symptom of clientelism. It's just one measurable symptom of clientelism. Okay, So what are our main data sources? We rely on a module of the Encuesta Longitudinal Colombiana de la Universidad de los Andes, which is called the ELCA. It's a politics module with which we specifically designed to be able to measure clientelism and tax evasion in ways that I'm going to describe in a few slides. It is the first larger scale household panel survey in Colombia. It has roughly 10,000 households, representative of the entire country and of urban Colombia and 5 rural regions. And it took a baseline in 2010, and then we built the politics module in 2013. And here, just an advertisement aside, this data is publicly available, and people here who are tuning in and are interested in these topics, I really encourage them to look at the data. There's much to be done, especially with the politics module. We are also going to look, so that this is not only based on Colombia, but we can send a message that is relevant elsewhere, at the 5th round of the Afrobarometer survey at some point. Okay, so let me stop at this point in case there are any questions before I move into showing you how we measure this. Good, so let me proceed. So how do we measure tax evasion? Now, one problem with tax evasion is that you may think that, at least in principle, if I go and ask people, hey, do you evade your taxes? Some people may be worried about telling the truth, and they would say, no, of course not. I'm a law-abiding citizen. I do not avoid any taxes. So to deal with this potential social desirability bias, so to speak, then what we do is we rely on this technique of list experiments, in which we don't ask people directly whether they evade taxes or not. We ask them indirectly in the following fashion. We select a random sample of respondents in the survey, and we ask, I want you to tell me not which of the following actions, but only how many of the following actions you do to sort of try to save some of your money. And the options, some of them are really not problematic at all, is, choosing a cheaper brand, buying bulk, going to a store that is further away because it's cheaper. And one of them is, I avoid the VAT. Then we have another randomly selected sample of people, and we ask them exactly the same question, but we leave out the sensitive item, which in this case is not paying the VAT. What's nice about this is that since these are 2 randomly selected samples of respondents, they are exactly identical, except that in the list of some of them, we have this additional sensitive item. So if I compare the average number of things that the guy in the left does to the average number of things that the guy in the right does, the difference, essentially, if you subtract 168 from 182, you will get the share of people who are evading taxes. Now, what do we find when we do this? We also reserved a bunch of people in this survey to ask them directly, hey, how often do you actually evade the VAT? And what's nice about our findings, or, in a sense, not surprising given the story that I shared at the beginning of the presentation, but kind of revealing of how accepted this practice is in Colombia, is that this is the estimate with the list. This is the estimate when I ask directly. There's no statistical difference between the two of them. So what this is telling you is that people not only accept that they evade the VAT when asked indirectly, they are also okay by accepting that up front. There is apparently no shame associated with it, very much in line with the audio that I shared with you, right? So 2 messages from here. Tax evasion is prevalent. About 15 to 20% of people, depending on the areas, tend to do it often. And second, they are not really ashamed of admitting to doing it. Now, we did a very similar design with clientelism. We asked people...
Leopoldo, can I ask a quick question? Do you guys have an idea of what's the prevalence of VAT tax evasion as opposed to income tax evasion or other types of tax evasion?
That's a good question. We did benchmark our estimates from VAT evasion with other estimates from the literature on VAT evasion, and our numbers seem to be very reasonable relative to what other people have computed for VAT evasion. Now, I have looked less at the numbers on estimates on income tax evasion. And I don't know at the top of my head what are the rates in Colombia. There is an interesting work on the wealth tax, which we have in Colombia, wealth tax, by Juliana Londoño, and she finds interesting elasticities with respect to some changes in the norms and in the tax rates. But that doesn't give you kind of an overall level of tax evasion. And I'm sorry, but I don't have the numbers on my head of how that compares. I would presume that they are in similar orders of magnitude, in the sense that there are high shares of people who are actually have to pay the income tax and don't do it, or that do it, but then use a number of tricks, which is, for example, what Juliana finds, to reduce their liabilities to the government. So in terms of the money that is lost to that, if you look at that in terms of how much money, not like how many people, I do remember that some of the most recent estimates from the DIAN, from the Revenue Office in Colombia, suggest pretty high levels, something that if we could improve enforcement, we could raise revenue in the amounts of 30% or things like that, which suggests an underlying evasion that is really high. So, there may be some taxes that it's more evasion, less evasion, but certainly these orders of magnitude of 16% and so on will not be rare in income taxes and other taxes.
Great, thank you.
Thanks to you. Okay, so on clientelism, we did a very similar design, so I can go faster through this one. What things do you normally have in mind when you are deciding how to vote for someone? Do you talk to friends? Do you look at the policy programs? Or do you sell your vote? And that's the sensitive item in this case, similar design and surprisingly similar results. High levels of incidence from 15 to 20% depending on the area, and no statistical difference between asking up front or asking indirectly. People are not ashamed to recognize this. So this already tells you that these two phenomena are somehow deeply embedded in society, so much so that they are prevalent and people don't feel that this is something that they should shy away from recognizing. Now, the second thing that I want to show you is that they seem to be empirically correlated to each other. This is a municipality level correlation between the two phenomena. It's very strong correlation and positive correlation that I'm going to show you now, not only at the municipal level, but at the individual level. So there is some correlation. It could be just, coincidence, but I'm going to show you a number of mechanisms for why this is probably something that actually reflects a deep relationship between the two phenomena. Now, the first thing is that graph that I just showed you is really very robust to actually looking at the individual level prevalence of clientelism and tax evasion, regardless of whether you control for municipality fixed effects, a number of individual controls that include things like age, and actually a polynomial on age, gender, race, ethnicity, geographic controls that include agricultural suitability, elevation, rainfall, ruggedness, a number of other variables. There is a very stable and positive correlation between the two phenomena. Now, I mentioned at the beginning, we don't have here kind of a natural or controlled experiment where we randomly assign levels of evasion and see the response of clientelism or vice versa. But we at least look at whether, the literature of selection on observables gives us some rule of thumb to kind of have a look at whether it is likely or not that unobservable characteristics may be driving this correlation, and therefore report some of the ratios used in this literature, the Alton-G ratio, the modified delta ratio from Oster, and the estimate of a lower bound effect by Oster. And I'm not going to go over each one of these coefficients each time. I just want to tell you that at least those exercises suggest that many of the correlations that I'm going to show you, actually all of the correlations that I'm going to show you, seem to be very strong, so much so that it is unlikely that they are going to simply wash away by controlling for some appropriate things that we are not being able to control for. Okay. Now, also, just before I get into the trap, into the mechanisms, I just want to show you that, this measure of clientelism that people report actually makes sense relative to what people interpret as clientelistic politics. if we look at the municipality level correlation between clientelism and preferential voting, which means when you are voting for the list for Senate or Congress, you don't vote for the party, but you vote for a certain person in the list, then there is a very strong positive correlation. And that is the landmark, that is a landmark measure of clientelistic, personalistic politics that is often used. Putnam used it in his work for Italy. And therefore, this gives us kind of an independent kind of a reality check that this clientelism is capturing something that we actually wanted to capture. Okay. So now let's move into kind of the core of our argument, which is that this correlation between these two phenomena actually reflects a number of mechanisms that ties them together. And that we call the weak state trap, because, you know, once clientelism makes tax evasion or state weakness to flourish, then state weakness also makes clientelism flourish, and so on. Okay, so the first mechanism is very traditional in the literature, is the issue of choosing public versus particularistic goods. In the presence of clientelism, politicians don't really have an incentive to give people public goods, because you cannot exclude people from public goods as easily. What you want to give is a particularistic benefit that you can exclude the beneficiary from if that beneficiary is not giving you your political support. That's why, you know, Susan Stokes calls clientelism perverse accountability. It is actually voters who are responding to the politician, hey, I did give you your vote, hey, I did give you the money for the campaign, than the politicians responding to the voters. And, you know, consistent with that idea, for most of these measures of public good provision that I'm showing you here, whether you are connected to the water service, electricity, whether you are connected to the gas system, you have a landline, which, you know, nowadays is not very important. By having a landline implies that you can have easy access to internet, sewage, trash collection, and so forth. Typically, with few exceptions, there is a negative correlation between clientelism and the provision of these public goods, and tax evasion and the provision of these public goods, which is also tends to be quite robust to the inclusion of the controls that I mentioned before. So, you know, this is the traditional idea. If you are with clientelism, you are not going to build the state capacities. You have no incentives to build the state capacities to provide broad-based public goods. And of course, if you do not provide broad-based public goods, people become more dependent of clientelism to get the things they need. So, you know, remember our friend, the politician, describing his work as a clientelistic politician. When people need things, there are powerful people who are going to get those things for them, and that makes the clientelistic politician thrive. A second mechanism is the following. Clientelism, just as Weber described, is not based on abstract and institutional links between the state and the citizens. It is actually based on this personal relation. And this personal relation displaces those institutional links. Is that the case in our data? Well, if personal relations are important, and there is interesting evidence for this from Paraguay by Finan and Schechter, for instance, then issues like reciprocity becomes very important. You want to target citizens when you are buying votes that are reciprocal, that you expect them to fulfill their part of the deal and give you their vote in exchange for whatever favor you are giving them, or whatever piece of money or cash or whatever. So we look here at the correlation between clientelism and reciprocity. We have two measures of reciprocity. Positive reciprocity is, I'll do you good if you do me good. And negative reciprocity is basically, I'll harm you if you harm me. In the case of Colombia, is basically el que la hace la paga, el que me la hace me la paga. It will be the Spanish, the expression in Spanish. And again, you know, with the exception on the correlation between positive reciprocity and tax evasion, once we control for a number of things, the rest of the correlations are not only positive, but quite robust to the different controls we find. So this is interesting. It is in line with the evidence that I mentioned exists already. And it's also important in the sense that it shows you that it's not so easy to finish clientelism with simple reforms, such as, for example, having a secret ballot. Because, you know, vote may be secret, But if people still feel a sense of obligation to whoever gave them the favor, they are going to still vote for the clientelistic politician. If we want to look in our data at more direct measures of these personal relationships, we can do it because we have in the politics module actually the question of whether you have personal appeals to congressmen or to local politicians in search of some favor that you need. And indeed, that's what we find. And again, we find a positive correlation with both clientelism and tax evasion that seems to be robust to the inclusion of the controls that we have. And remember, this is household data with a rich set of controls that we can have, and that is showing this deep connection that goes even at the individual level, something that in the literature, to the best of our knowledge, is not as examined as other type of kind of more municipality or even country level correlations. Now, one reaction with this is, okay, but maybe they're appealing to these politicians because they believe in democracy, and it's not kind of because they have this personal relationship. It is because actually they believe these guys should be accountable to them, so they are reaching out to get the things that they deserve. But that doesn't seem to be the story, because actually we find a negative correlation between clientelism and tax evasion, again, robust to the inclusion of our controls, and again, not seemingly dominated by potential unobservables, which suggests that these people are actually cynical about democracy. They reach out personally, but they do think that democracy is not working well, because precisely they are embedded in these clientelism and clientelistic relationships, and they know that democracy is actually working by this prior exchange of favors and not by the state responding to some demand of rights institutional that you are entitled to. Okay. So that's one first mechanism through which displacing institutional links and replacing them with personal links gets us into this weak state trap. A second mechanism is that when you have all these personal links, you create fragmentation. You fragment society, and a fragmented society cannot get together to obtain collective, goals. They cannot solve the collective action problems in ways that they can make the state accountable and produce this kind of synergy that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, in which you want to make the state more powerful because you can control it. But if you want to control it, you have to solve the collective action problem to control it. But with clientelism, you are fragmented, you will not control it, you will have a state that is weak, and you want it to remain weak because you know that you cannot control it. So again, a trap. And indeed, we find that places, people with more clientelistic attitudes and with more willingness to evade taxes are indeed less likely to participate in different types of protests, which is the measure that we have here as a measure of organizing collective action. And just a couple of, anecdotal kind of additional evidence here. This lack of a symbiotic relationship between control and power, which in this case works as a negative loop, because I cannot control the state, I do not want to give them power, is actually described by many other authors in Colombia. The quote that I bring here is from Archer. He mentions how clientelistic networks in Colombia produce this atomized citizenry, which relates to the state on a personal level and is really fragmented. And he discusses with a bunch of case studies how this not only creates this collective action problem, but also it makes it very difficult for the state to look for long-run endeavors, because those long-run endeavors and those reforms that produce kind of a collective benefit are really hard to get if everyone is looking just for their private benefit. So that's another negative thing. You cannot build a state. Actually, in fact, creating a state is one such collective endeavor. So I think that quote that I'm highlighting here for you is kind of very telling of the very mechanism that we are discussing here. Okay. So those were two mechanisms having to do with a fragmented society. Now I'm going to discuss two mechanisms having to do with how the social contract, that ideal social contract in which the state is accountable to the citizens, and that's the duty that the state must fulfill. And then the citizens have a duty as well. They have to abide by the law, and that includes paying taxes, is broken under clientelism. And one reason is obvious, is because both sides are mutually justified in their decision to default the social contract once they start, exchanging private benefits for political support, like exchanging a vote for some money or some benefit for my family. Think of the voter thinking here. The voter says, okay, if this politician is giving me some money for the vote, he's getting that money back in some way. He's probably getting to office to get some private rents. So if he's not doing things and the money that I would pay for taxes is going to go to his private benefit, why should I pay taxes? And the politician probably has a similar process of justifying his misbehavior on the grounds of the behavior of the citizens. And of course, this is not very easy to test, but luckily, at least we can look at some correlations with our household data at whether people who are more likely to participate in clientelism and tax evasion are also more likely to agree that sometimes you should break the law, sometimes it's okay to bribe someone, sometimes it's okay to take your justice into your own hands. And those are very positively correlated phenomena, and again, very stable and very robust to our controls. Now, the second mechanism related to this broken social contract one has to do with the role of elections. This role is undermined under clientelism. In an ideal role of elections, you don't forget about your role right after the election. You vote, and then you have to look at whether or not the politician that you voted for is fulfilling their promises, whether that politician is actually behaving well in office, whether you should file a complaint, whether you should, gather information as to whether the politician is fulfilling its policy program and so forth. Now, with clientelism, that doesn't have to be the case because the deal is over once you get your private benefit. You don't have to figure out whether the politician is behaving properly more generally if you know that he basically fulfilled the part of the deal with you personally. So what we find here, when we look at the data, is that people who are more likely to engage in clientelism and who are more likely to evade taxes are not simply politically detached. In fact, if anything, they are more likely to have a party identity. They are more likely to try to persuade other people to vote for someone. They are more likely to have a defined ideology. So they are politically engaged. Actually, they are in these clientelistic networks, but they do not collect information. So this also undermines that this is not as simple to solve as just saying people should be involved in politics. No, the problem is how do they get involved in politics? If you get involved in politics and you become loyal to a party because the politician or the broker from that party always gives you a bit of cash or some other favor when you are going to vote, that's, you are politically engaged, but you are not really overseeing their behavior in politics in general. You are not really overseeing democratic institutions. And in fact, what this tells us is that these people are less likely to be doing that. They are less likely to be getting informed. Okay. Now, as a final remark.
Can I have a question?
Oh yes, of course. Sorry, I haven't stopped for a while, so a good point to stop for any questions. Thank you, Ras.
So I guess you're painting a very bleak picture here, where basically the social contract is completely broken and it's replaced with this sort of particularistic contracts where both sides, both the demand and the supply side sort of agree to cooperate in this more privatized contracts, right? But I mean, what about the rule of law, right? I mean, all these, Colombia and all these other countries that have clientelism and tax evasion, they have some laws, right? They have a constitution, they have some courts. I mean, where are the courts? Why isn't the law enforced in these societies where, you know, what happens to these impartial actors that are supposed to monitor and prosecute these illegal acts? Like, where are they? I don't hear their role in this story.
Yeah, thank you, Raz. That's a very relevant point. So I think I have two reactions to that. On the one hand, that obviously I'm just simplifying the picture to show the mechanism that or the mechanisms that underlie this sort of trap. But of course, in reality, this trap coexists in almost every society with some more positive features of the state. So Colombia has these features of state weakness and these features of clientelism, but it also has some features of state strength and some features of different types of relationship with politics. So, for instance, I could tell you also a positive story in Colombia about the way in which health, the provision of services in public health, have changed dramatically. And partly that has to do with the fact that even though there is prevalent clientelism in health services in Colombia, there is also in Colombia the idea that you have the right to have good services and access to health. And some people have demanded that, not personally as a favor to politicians, but have demanded that institutionally and have appealed to the courts, a key actor, as you mentioned, to say, hey, it turns out that I have the right to have a good a health service, but it turns out that in Colombia, and this is a kind of a true case, um, people who are in the health service but are subsidized get less benefit than people who are in the health service but pay for it. And that seems to be unconstitutional because we all have the fundamental human right to good access to health. And that was an appeal to the court that was made in Colombia. And as a result of that appeal, the Constitutional Court said you have to unify the health benefits program for people who are in the subsidized side of it or in the contributing side of it. And that's exactly a consensual state working. I'm trying to make the state respond to me. I'm trying to control it, and the state is responding. So definitely, these things coexist in Colombia, and I'm sure in many other places. And this is a complicated race, and of course, and I'm just showing you kind of the dark side of the equation. But I certainly think that the other side is also present, and that institutions like the courts could be important in that process. And although of course courts can also be subject to clientelism, no? So, and I can give you again examples in which some judges have been found to give favorable sentences or make decisions in exchange for some political support. Um, I could give you examples of Colombian politicians who are not clientelistic and who have been elected on a non-clientelistic programmatic basis and have then been responsive to the citizens' demands and so forth. So yes, the actors that you mentioned are important. There are many forces at play at the same time. I'm just kind of emphasizing one powerful force to keeping the state weak, but at the same time, there are some forces which luckily sometimes are powerful enough to counteract these other forces, such that the state gets strengthened. So, very relevant. It allows me to make this, to clarify how far we can go with this.
Thank you. So we have more questions, but do you think you can finish like maybe in 5 minutes?
Yes, I have just 2 slides left, so I could finish now, or I could take questions, whatever you.
Why don't you finish and then we'll go to the Q&A.
Perfect. So the only remaining slides is just so that this is not only in Colombia. There's a round of Afrobarometer that asks for a measure that is roughly related to not paying government fees, so something like tax evasion, and clientelism. How often do you sell your vote? And within that African sample, we also see the very strong correlation. The Afrobarometer round is not as rich as our survey to look at all the mechanisms, but at least the correlation is present. And that's kind of what I wanted to mention, only that I've shown you very detailed kind of evidence for Colombia, but this is relevant for many developing countries in which politics works this way. And the conclusion is really just a picture. I just shown this kind of a potential loop that exists between clientelism favoring state weakness and then state weakness creating clientelism for a number of reasons, with the very important caveats that I made following Raf's question, that it's not that this is the only force in town. There are, of course, other opposing forces that operate even in very clientelistic countries like Colombia. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions or reactions.
Great, thank you so much. So we have several questions. I'm gonna call them up in the order. And the first one is Carlos Cartassini. And Carlos, please go ahead and unmute your mic.
Hi, thank you, Russ. Thank you, Leopoldo. Just, a very interesting presentation, and always, as always. I have an issue here, at least the way I heard the story, it was very atemporal, okay? This is just like a characteristic of Colombia, and probably, it has always been like this, or at least you don't make a very strong statement about, whether this applies to today or, to 200 years ago, or will also apply in the future. Of course, your data is temporal, but your story is more atemporal. However, if I think about, the book I published with Eduardo Lora, where we have papers there by Mauricio Cárdenas and Mónica Pachón, Marcela Eslava and Marcela Meléndez, etc., where we look at the consequences of the constitutional reform, basically our story there is, in a way, it's that institutions matter a lot in Colombia, okay? That the change in the electoral system matter a lot in order to explain, the rise and fall of parties, how parties operated, how, the different actors could make intertemporal transactions. You talk a lot about this ability or inability of the country to, have these long-term policies, etc. And we tell that same story, but we are looking at institutions. We see how institutions change and how that affected the equilibrium. And we look at the high-level institutions, again, the electoral systems, and so on, how that, how some of the institutions affected the relationship between the government and the private sector, and how the new institutions, allow for, more clientelistic relationships, while before it was more institutionalized. But also, we also look at the low-level institutions, how, having auxilios parlamentarios, affect the way transactions are conducted, or what, and now we know about the mermelada, how the mermelada affects the ability to conduct transactions. So it looks like in the case of Colombia, there is a very strong relationship, at least in the story we tell, of institutions changing these relationships, changing these equilibriums, changing this ability to make these intertemporal transactions, so to follow these, long-term policies. So I wanted to, to hear a reaction about that, because again, your story looks more atemporal, at least in the way you presented it, and kind of, independent of the specifics of the institutions. Thank you.
Leo, please keep your answers within maybe 2 minutes so we can get to the other questions also.
Sure, Raz. No, thank you, Carlos. I think this is very interesting, how this works dynamically and how it interacts with institutions and with institutional reform. On the one hand, I think that there is, of course, a very long-term story to tell about this, and we do have some discussion of that in the paper, on what are the origins of this, and they do go very far back, even to agrarian relationships in the classic kind of clientelistic relationship between, the patron and the client. And then it becomes modernized and it exists in more modern form of ways. So yes, this is kind of a trap that also creates dynamic incentives, precisely because of the mechanisms that I mentioned, to persist. Now, it doesn't mean that institutions do not matter. They do matter in two ways. Sometimes they can weaken the clientelistic relationships, and I think that has happened to some extent. And what I mentioned about, the changes in health provision in Colombia largely reflects how the Constitution gave a right to the citizens that now they can use to demand in an institutional way access to certain services, and not necessarily asking help from a given politician. But the other way in which institutions sometimes matter is that because these mechanisms are resilient, then the form of clientelism will change, and you will find a way to use the new institution to still have clientelistic relationships. I think that's the case with auxilios parlamentarios. We forbid the auxilios parlamentarios, but we still have a number of additional ways to repartir mermelada, essentially to have some other token of exchanges for favors for political support. And then the last way in which this interacts is that, yes, there is institutional change, but how far do you go into institutional change is sometimes limited by precisely the clientelistic incentives. So you would see that there's been efforts for electoral reforms in Colombia for years and years and years. And we have said, you know, we should get rid of the voto preferente. And we do a bunch of the recommendations that experts give and so on. But the voto preferente is something that several congressmen really like because it's part of their clientelistic advantage, and that doesn't get through. So I think all of these interactions are fascinating. So yeah, you know, I didn't discuss them in detail, but I do think that they operate at least in the ways that I just mentioned here.
Perfect, thank you. Next question is from Roger Bancor. Roger, please unmute your mic.
Yes. Is there any relationship between the type of public goods that are demanded and supplied between the patron and the client and your data? Like in some public, you mentioned health services, but you mentioned it as an example. Is there any kind of public goods, private goods, club goods are more sensitive to clientelistic relationships, or you haven't thought about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess that, you know, there are a lot of gray areas. The standard answer is that the more excludable the good is, the more ideal it is for the clientelistic relationship, because if it's more of a club good or it's hard to have exclusion, then it is not as effective because you cannot withdraw it from whoever didn't give you some support. But that's not exactly how it works in practice, and you will see clientelism occurring with things that have some public component to it, even like roads. But then how do you build the road, and who do you contract, and exactly in front of whose farm it goes will be part of the private benefit that you get for it. So we do have some data in our survey, but I'm not sure if we have enough data. But that's an interesting thought that I will hold, because it will be nice to code the extent of publicness of the goods and to see if this falls in line with what we would expect, which is that especially the excludable goods are the ones that are really attractive for these clientelistic relationships.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Philip Kiefer. Phil, please unmute your mic.
Thanks, Raz. Hi, Leopoldo. This is great.
Phil, I cannot hear you very well. I don't know if the rest of the people are getting you, but I hear you very, very low. Even.
I'm not sure what I can do about it. Is that better?
It is much better. It is much better.
Great. All right. Thank you. Sorry. So anyway, super. I love this stuff. I love the correlations. I love the ideas behind it. So I just had two suggestions. One is one is underlying all of this kind of thing is this idea of obstacles to collective action by people. And you have data in ECLA about participation in groups. And it might be interesting to see how participation in groups, what differences in participation affects people, is correlated with some of the variables you found. We, Rats and Carlos and I did a cool survey for the DIA 2018. And one of the questions that we think was pretty innovative was asking people if they thought that in their neighborhood they could get 300 signatures or 500 signatures to bring a petition to the alcaldía to get their sidewalks fixed. And we found that variation in answers to that question were associated with variations in preference for public goods, but especially in trust in politicians. And I think that's relevant. And it's relevant because of a second point I wanted to, or just suggestion or observation, that you guys are treating your pitch is that this is a unique approach to treating clientelism as a systemic, deeply rooted equilibrium. And it's fine, that's great, but it's not like the only show in town in that regard. There's those other angles that are also talking about clientelism as systemic that are completely complementary, or even, I mean, like the stuff that Rats and I did talks a lot about the ability of voters to trust politician promises. Like if they don't believe the promises, that leads to preferences for clientelist transactions between politicians and voters, less public goods, lower taxes. So all these phenomena that you're documenting through your theoretical framework emerge in others as well. And I think it's useful to lay them all out there. They all ultimately get down to some kind of collective action problem. And in the context of prior literature, again, the stuff I know most is associated with political parties, where political parties are underdeveloped, not institutionalized, incapable of representing the collective interests of voters. Again, you see these phenomena. And I think that's kind of the other side of the coin, or quite related to the arguments you're making. I mean, that's why I'm so enthusiastic about the arguments you're making, I guess. I think that's it. But this is great. Anyway, thanks a lot for giving the talk.
Thanks,
No,
Phil.
thanks to you, Phil. Yeah.
Leopoldo, please keep your answer in within 2 minutes again, because we're out of time. Thank you.
Sure. No, about what Phil just said, I don't have much to say. That thank you for the suggestion. We're going to have a look at those questions on group participation. That's great. And on the second point, I completely agree with you. We see these not as actually, we're trying to organize several of the mechanisms that are there in the literature, and we claim no kind of originality in claiming that this is hard to escape and that this is systemic and so forth. And if we are missing kind of something that really rings with our argument, please do send it along. And this paper is under review, but I really want precisely, this is kind of a sort of kind of a big picture kind of discussion, but it's also kind of linking the ideas in the literature. So we want to be as fair as possible. And if we're missing important points, please do share them.
Thank you so much. This was a very interesting presentation. Thanks, Leopoldo. And also thank you to everyone who joined us today. The next political economy seminar will be on February 26th on a topic to be determined. I hope you can make it. And until then, goodbye, everyone.
Bye, Ras. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, again for tuning in and for your interest.
Bye.